What's up guys, today on Dirt Lifestyle we're going to talk about suspension, specifically long arms versus short arms. If you've been around on forums and you've looked at this topic, you know it is a mess. There is a ton of opinion and not a lot of fact, so I wanted to make a video that can clear this up for the guy that just got his Jeep, he's looking to upgrade, he wants to lift it, and he can't decide whether or not to do long arms or short arms. By the end of this video, I want to make sure you have the tools, so whenever you go to make this purchase, you can decide very accurately whether or not you need it. When I started planning this video, it was very important to me to do an apples to apples comparison. So I wanted to have two of the same vehicle, one short arm, one long arm. For the short arm, we have my brother's 2001 Jeep TJ with a 4-inch spring and 1/2-inch puck and a 1-inch body lift. For the long arm, we have my 2002 Jeep TJ with a 4.5-inch spring, no puck, and a 1-inch body lift. So they're virtually the same. They're so similar. The only difference between the two is tire size, but when it comes to long arms and short arms, tire size is not really much of a factor. The first thing we need to establish is the horizontal movement throughout the suspension travel. This is something that's really important to establish first so we can understand all the arguments for and against long arm versus short arm suspension. This side of the Jeep is at ride height, so we are at 16.5 inches to the center of the hub, and that's exactly what it is on the other side. The reason I wanted to do this is so we can see how much down travel we're gonna have and how much movement we're gonna have throughout that down travel. We're gonna measure the horizontal movement with this laser, and this laser is gonna give us a center line to follow throughout the suspension travel. All right, that is perfectly centered. Now we can droop this axle down as far as it'll go. Because this vehicle is a short arm, we have a ton of movement. We've got an 1.5 inches. So it drooped down from 16.5 to about 12. So we've gone down about 4.5 inches. And in 4.5 inches of down travel, we have shifted the axle back towards the Jeep 1.5 inches. That's a lot of horizontal movement, and this is the problem with a short arm suspension system. The reason there's so much horizontal movement is because with a short arm, the arms are already down at the lower part of the arc. So you want to be basically parallel at ride height if possible, because it makes it to where as your suspension travels up or down, it won't be these really extremes horizontal movements like we're seeing here. And as you can see a little bit closer now, you can see how far the laser is from the center line of that axle. I'll set my camera up right here so you can see as I jack this back up to center line, that laser is just gonna slowly get closer to the center of the hub. Now we're going to do the same thing in my Jeep, but in order to keep things as apples to apples as possible, we're going to drop it down 4.5 inches so you can see how much horizontal movement there is whenever you drop it down the same amount of space. As you can see, my lower control arm mounts way farther back on the Jeep, and this makes it to where at ride height, it's very horizontal. It doesn't really drop hardly at all. And the upper control arm is almost flat at ride height. So this means that it's going to give us a lot larger arc, and we're going to see how much this affects our horizontal movement. All right, so now we've only got, man, a little bit less than 1/2 inch of horizontal movement in this case. So about 1/3, a little bit less than 1/3 actually. So this is sitting 4.5 inches lower than it was before. And as you can see, these arms, upper and lower, have barely changed their position at all. And that's a good thing, and we're about to talk about why. There's a claim that I've seen made on a number of different forums from a number of different people, and that is that short arm suspension systems and long arm suspension systems ride the exact same, and the reason that companies are selling long arm suspension systems is to get more of your money. It's basically like a big conspiracy or something like that. I don't know if there's a big conspiracy to get more of your money. There very well might be. But the claim that a short arm suspension system and a long arm suspension system ride the same is simply not true. Not only by seat of the pants feel, I have a lot of experience driving both, and there is a clear difference between the two, but you can actually prove it whenever you watch the arc of the travel of suspension that there is not going to be the exact same ride quality based on the characteristics of how they handle. As we were able to prove with our test at the beginning of this video, that horizontal line is much greater with a short arm suspension system. What does this mean? This means that when you're driving forward and you go over a speed bump, that energy is pushing out towards the speed bump instead of just going straight up. And what this does is it pushes the entire vehicle up over the bump instead of the suspension compressing and just going over the bump. this will obviously change the ride characteristics of the vehicle. It's something you can clearly feel, and whenever you go over a speed bump, you will clearly notice that the vehicle is going up and down. It feels like you're jumping, and that's because you are. If you took a camera and you put it right next to that speed bump, you would notice you are getting a little bit of air. Now, this is something that can still happen with a long arm suspension system based on a whole bunch of different factors, but it's not happening because of geometry. It could happen because you have super stiff springs or you have super stiff shocks or something like that. But the negatives of a short arm suspension system don't just stop at ride quality. If you need to go over an obstacle and the obstacle is like the same size as your tire, we've all seen rocks that are the same size as our tires, and it goes straight up and then out like this. For you to be able to push your Jeep over this obstacle, you don't want to be pushing any energy into the rock. You want to try to push all the energy over the rock. Now, if you have a short arm suspension system, it's pushing energy into the rock as well as energy up over the rock. If you have a long arm suspension system, because the arc is so much longer, it makes it easier for your tire to climb up and over the obstacle. And this is really apparent with an undercut. An undercut is the worst nightmare for someone with a short arm suspension system. And the reason why is because if you have undercut and this obstacle is wrapping back through and onto the tire like this, because you are pushing energy forward into the undercut, it makes it way harder to go over the undercut. Now, anyone who has driven over an undercut, me included, we all know that they're tough anyway. But if you have any of that energy trying to go up into this lip, you're not gonna get through it. You're not gonna get over it. You're gonna have to either winch over it, you're gonna have to high lift jack your tire up or something creative. But this is a clear axle breaker. I've seen people break axles by getting into an undercut and having short arm suspension systems. There's so much binding with this undercut because the energy is pushing forward as well as up. It makes it towards a really hard obstacle to get through. Now, if we take the exact same vehicle and we add long arms, so the arc is now starting way back here, this makes it to where the vehicle's wheel is gonna end up going up instead of forward. There is something else I haven't talked about yet, and that would be lowering where these arms mount. So you could take your upper arm, you can mount it here, you can take a lowering bracket of some kind, and you can mount it here, and this will help a ton with a short arm suspension system because it's gonna locate your short arms to the middle of the arc instead of being on the lower side of the arc. This is gonna change the way it rides. It's gonna be much more of a factory feel, but you also will have some big bracket that's hanging way down like this. And you know, that could be a big deal or not a big deal based on how you wheel and the type of terrain you're in. With my suspension, I actually did both. I lengthened the arms and I took the arms and I mounted them lower. And that's why with my suspension system, you can see that there's very little movement of the arms with the up and down travel of the wheel. It makes it to where it's an extremely predictable ride, and it's awesome. It rides great. Something else that should be considered is ground clearance. With a long arm, you have more stuff under the Jeep. A lot of people will claim that it's more things to get hung up on, and maybe that's true. It is not something I've ever experienced, and there's a reason why. This is what my lower arm is made out of. It's 2-inch DOM with a 1/4-inch wall. Whenever you go over a rock or something, it doesn't get hung up on this, it just slides. I mean, this is very hard and it doesn't gouge or anything like that. So it just slides right over the rock and you just keep moving forward. If I have one of my links that touches a rock, the Jeep just pulls it right over. It's never been a big deal to me. I guess for some people it has been. There's people online at least that will claim that it's been an issue for them, but I have been wheeling with long arms for maybe 12 years or at least 10, and I haven't had this issue before. With a short arm, you will have less arm to get hung up on off-road, but a lot of times you can still hit your bracket, and that's the only thing I could really see you getting hung up on, and you will have a low-hanging bracket, whether it's a short arm or a long arm. So I don't really see getting hung up on obstacles as being something that should be a deciding factor, but it's something that you might want to consider. TJs, XJs, WJs, ZJs, they all have these super short arms from the factory, and all the problems we talked about today are definitely the worst in those vehicles. You will have a little bit more forgiveness out of a JL or a JK because the arms are longer from the factory. They're not a whole lot longer. It's not like they're double or anything like that, but they're definitely longer, and they will be much more forgiving whenever you lift them. However, if you go too high, then you will have the same problems as everybody else. At the end of the day, it's all about geometry. It's much more about geometry than it is about the actual arm length itself. So the location of the arm affects everything, no matter what type of four-wheel drive, four-link vehicle you have. One argument that I don't see online, which I find really interesting, is that short arms are stronger than long arms. Now, this is thicker material than you'll see in any short arm. This is 2-inch DOM with a 1/4-inch wall. It's super, super strong. I mean, it's crazy strong, but it's long. So because this is so long, it makes it weak in terms of leverage. If you come down hard on an obstacle in the middle of this thing, it's way more likely you're gonna bend it than a short arm. Since a short arm is so much shorter, there's not near as much leverage, so even though it's made out of smaller material, it can be really, really strong because there's no leverage on it. So that is a pro short arm argument that I don't see used ever, but it's definitely something that you can think about. Depending on what your build is, depending on the weight of the vehicle, depending on the length of the vehicle, there's so many different factors. What kinds of things you're going out and doing with it. Long arm and short arm suspensions can have pros and cons either way. At the end of the day, I am much more of a long arm guy than I am a short arm guy. But as I've mentioned throughout this video, geometry is #1 for me. Geometry is so much more important than either, because you can still have a really good performing vehicle with a short arm if it's done correctly. But with the kinds of things that I do, a long arm is much, much better off-road. So it all just depends on the kind of build you have. If you guys want to learn more about flex steer, bump steer, suspension geometry, any of that other kind of stuff that pertains to this same wheelhouse, make sure you check out my Jeep TJ stretch series. I cover all of it in there. I use real world examples so you can understand exactly what these different terms mean and how it applies in the real world. If this is a video that you guys enjoyed, make sure you give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I've got a whole bunch of how-to content and some informational stuff like this. And if you want to follow me on social media, I'm at Dirt Lifestyle Nate. We'll see you next time.